Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the end of the colonial empires and the self-government movement for blacks in Africa following the end of World War II, and particularly focusing on Rhodesia, which is later called Zimbabwe, and their fall into a state of utter disrepair, and of course, following 20 odd years on from that, the fall of South Africa. Remember, South Africa and Rhodesia were some of the richest per capita countries in the world when they were run by the whites. Now they're utter basket cases, and it happened, within a generation. They went from one of the richest countries to one of the poorest countries. So that just shows how quickly things, spiral out of control when the efficient and capable white managers are taken out purely on the basis of race hustling and supposed pursuit of equal Marxist type outcomes. Now, when World War II ended, the colonial powers generally had, because they'd been soundly thrashed and defeated by not only the Germans but also the Japanese, and so the omnipotence, if you like, that the white races were seen in had certainly taken a heavy hit, and the Soviet Union, which was now a major superpower, and the Cold War, placed non-aligned countries that weren't necessarily directly relevant to the overall military or potential military jostling that came with the Cold War, places like Africa and all the third world countries, really. They're the heavyweights of the day, the Americans and the Russians jostled for influence, and this is where tin pot dictators came in. As long as you're on our side, then we'll support you type attitude. Now, on top of this, the Americans wanted the British to divest of their empire on the basis of free peoples and democracy and self-determination, which all sounds very good when you're talking about first world people who've got a culture of democracy and shared power and national cohesion and the common good, and that sort of thing. Then those sort of sentiments are reasonable enough. But when you're talking about people that are still sort of really converting from the Stone Age into something a little bit more modern, then those sort of sentiments are absurd and very, very destructive, which of course they all proved to be. On top of that, the communist agitators were hard at work, and again, they were seriously well cashed up and supplied, where communist guerrillas were, and Soviet-trained communist guerrillas, your outcome isn't equal with the white guy. Your outcome isn't equal with those rich white guys. That means you're being oppressed. That means you have the right to take up arms. And the Soviet constitution was, within the constitution, was they had a clause or clauses in their constitution which said they would support any communist uprising anywhere in the world. So they would just send in a few shit stirrers into Africa who would create a bit of a stir, and then they, that's a communist uprising. Our constitution says we have to support them. So they would supply arms and say technicians and military advisors and so on so Africa was a bit of a hotbed of unrest, and the idea was, well, equal outcomes. All blacks should have, the illiterate peasant in the mud hut should have an equal outcome with the wealthy and middle class white guy, or upper, aristocratic type white guy. You should have all equal outcomes, and anything that's not equal outcomes is oppression, and it's terrible, it's bad. We've got to have a revolution to overturn it. And so all these things were going on. These were the vapors of the mind, if you like, of the day. Now, the various European powers that really didn't have the ability to sort of withstand, Belgium and so on, and they were forced to give up their colonies, and Now, there's a lot of talk about how the white people were exploiting the natural resources of Africa. Well, the resources were there a long time before whites turned up, and the Africans had never done anything with them. And since the white people have gone, the Africans haven't done much with them. So the idea that the white people were taking, raw materials of any sort, doesn't matter whether it's, I don't know, gold or diamonds or anything, iron ore or something, coal. The only reason that was those resources could be exploited was the white people were building the ports, putting the railways in, the roads, the facilities, the warehouses, and they had the technology to extract the resources which the locals didn't have. And as soon as the white people went away, then the whole thing came to a screaming halt. But nonetheless, before whatever exploitation took place, there was a lot of technology that was brought in, a lot of resources and infrastructure that was put in place, so that those resources could be taken advantage of. So the idea of some one-way exploitation is simply nonsense and can be dismissed out of hand. Nonetheless, the Americans on one side were pestering the British and the Europeans generally to give up their colonies, and the Russians, the Soviet Union, the communists, with the Chinese playing a role too later on, were also sending in agitators and stirrers and guerrillas to create these uprisings. And this was part of the Rhodesian thing, or Zimbabwe as it later became. Now, the white people who were, when the whites arrived in what became Rhodesia, the local people were sparse. There was not like there was some big population that was displaced. That's bullshit. There was a hunter-gatherer population that moved around, but there were no crops or anything. You'd find the odd seasonal growing of yams or something, but basically it was there were millions of acres of good quality farmland that wasn't being used. None of the local resources that were available were being used. So Rhodesia became the breadbasket of a very, very successful agricultural and farming community. Now, because it was successful and because there's a lot to be had and a lot of benefits that were now there because the white man had established a stable, prosperous society, a lot of black people started moving into the area from other places around Africa, which not only created tribal tensions within Rhodesia, but also you had many more black people coming in. Now, the whites should have stopped that, and the dangers came later on when, with all these black people running around, the international agitators and stirrers and the Americans being part of this were saying, well, look at all these black people. How come they don't have representation in Parliament? How come they don't have why aren't they getting equal outcomes with the white folks? And if the black people were, and that there was a very small middle class of black people who had nice houses and had their own farms. But it was a very small thing. Now, what the Soviets and the Americans wanted effectively was push a button. Push a button today, and suddenly everything is now equal. And of course, that's insanity, not reality. But it was nonetheless what was being pushed for various background reasons. The Soviets to push communism, the Americans to make sure Britain's empire was being dismembered. The Americans overthought were overthinking it by a huge stretch, that this empire made Britain rich and powerful, when in fact this wasn't the case. Now, nonetheless, Rhodesia, as it then was doing very, very well and was a rich and prosperous society, but it was demanded, insisted, and there was effectively a civil war over it, that the British, the white people should hand over power to the majority black population. Now, when the whites first arrived, there had not been a black majority population. It was just these roaming hunter-gatherers. It was only after the place became prosperous because of the white people that the blacks started to move in quantity, and then the medicines and the help they had, because they had a 50% mortality rate with new births, and that mortality rate was reduced to 10% or something with white medicine and white medical care. So the combination of many blacks moving in, and then the benefit of plentiful food, the benefit of medical care, meant that the black population ballooned, then that in turn was then used to say, look at all these black people. They're not having, they need representation. They need this. And when in fact it was an artificially built black population from the prosperity that the whites created. Nonetheless, the end result was that the white government handed over power to the blacks, and the blacks managed to ruin the place in 20 to 25 years. It went from being one of the most prosperous places in Africa, in fact, the second most prosperous place in Africa, to being a bankrupt, failed state basket case. That's how quickly it happened. So what lessons were there for the white South African government? So the white South African government, which was sort of the Dutch Boer type government, and these guys weren't idiots. They were quite good. They were quite bright and sensible, practical, capable people. They weren't morons, far from it. And they would be looking at all this and all this communist agitation. They'd be looking at all the black people that came into Rhodesia and how that affected what happened. They'd be looking at the international community and the demands for equality with white and black equality and equality of outcome. They'd be looking at all of that stuff, and if I assume they'd be thinking, well, gee whiz, what can we do to avoid these quite unfortunate developments? Because given the international pressure, the direction that the narrative is heading, and the Soviet agitation, all that stuff, the American pressure, you name it, the United Nations pressure, we're already getting difficult questions in that regard. So we're going to start getting some very serious pressure coming soon. At the moment, they're kicking the shit out of Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, but they'll come for us any day now. What can we do? Now, during this time, say when the real trouble kicked off in Rhodesia, and the time when the government of South Africa was handed over to the blacks, during that time, millions upon millions of blacks were pouring into South Africa, pouring in huge numbers. Over that time, I would think close on 10 million blacks came into South Africa, which created this very large imbalance. You've got a few million white people and 30 million black people. And so look at all the 30 million black people. Where's their parliamentary representation? Why don't they have equal outcomes? Why are they living in shanty towns? Why do they not have equality? And all these questions that you get from sociology undergraduates or people with that sort of mentality. And the folks doing, I've got a degree in lesbian dance. I can morally lecture you about the equality of black people. That all that sort of nonsense is going around. So you're the white government of South Africa. You see all this happening. What precautions would you take? Because you don't want that happening to you. And that's the trend. That's the narrative. That's the way everything's heading. So it's going to come for you pretty soon. So what can you do today to stave that off? Well, you can stop black people from coming into the country. That would be one thing. You can also create a completely independent state. So we're going to create an independent state, move the black people in that independent state, build up some basic infrastructure for, make sure they've got everything there, like electricity generation and a dam and a port, so they can have access to the maritime trade routes and so on. So, but move the black people. Leave a few black people. So if you've got 3 million white people, have no more than 1 million, 2 million black people in the community or something, and then make a concerted effort to develop a middle class, and which the South African government was attempting to do. They were talking about the amount of time it's going to take. And the international community back in the day wanted instant push button outcomes. We just want to flick a switch and it's all equality will magically appear like from a magic wand. And the quite understandably the Boer government of South Africa said, hey, it's going to take longer than that. Don't be silly. And the realities of these people and their tribal sort of antics and behaviors, you need to come to grips with that before you understand how a middle class can be developed. But my sort of concern is this, and maybe those more familiar with South African affairs than certainly I am, and I'm not pretending, by the way, to be an expert in South African affairs, but but this idea that you could see the train coming down the track, it was there. You couldn't miss it. You could not see it coming. What measures did you take to stave off that possibility? Why didn't you create a completely, not just a little sort of self-governing little piece of the territory for black, not that, a completely independent nation state and populate it with black people, like, you know, I don't know, like a, you know, Haiti or Nigeria or something, just completely populate it, you know, move all the blacks to there, and again, build the infrastructure for them, give them, and if they don't maintain that infrastructure or destroy it, that's their lookout, but give them a start, and then you can keep South Africa for the you know, for the white people, and, or more importantly, keep South Africa rich and prosperous, run by capable administrators and people, and they'll inevitably be white. And then the whole debacle, which turned out to be South Africa, could be staved off. So two or few questions I have is, why did the South African government, the white South African government, not respond to the oncoming train in the tunnel when clearly it was coming along at high speed? Why did they not create a completely separate nation state for blacks only and move the black? And why did they not reduce the number of blacks to be approximately equal to or less than the whites, and then give very gradual representation to that group of people, which you could, you know, handpick. Maybe you have people coming in on work permits to do other work, I don't know, pick apples or something. But nonetheless, it certainly seems to me that the white South African government dug their heels in. No, we're maintaining the status quo. That's it, and we'll fight to the death on really that hill, which they were always going to lose on. And why did they do that? And that to me would seem a counterproductive view. But maybe I'm misunderstanding things. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.